But freight and logistics, as we know, have changed, and probably irrevocably so, and all as a result of COVID-19. But of course, it's not just COVID-19 that has caused some disruption in the international freight world of late. We've also had blockages in the Suez Canal, we've had trade wars and all manner of other things, and the reality is that all of these things are likely to continue into the future. And that makes it all the more important for all of us who are involved in international trade to take note and to make some changes while we can. Now, just to recap some of the current problems with freight services. Freight costs, of course, have increased, and demurrage charges are also making a very handsome profit for carriers. Air freight charges have rocketed, and delays are a constant as belly space remains low. And that, of course, continuing into the future. And every time we have disruptions, both internationally or domestically, and lockdowns, it means that there are fewer aircraft in the sky. There is an imbalance of containers with more imports than exports. There is some reluctance from shipping lines to take empty containers, but that is changing as well as those containers are starting to be needed elsewhere. There are also bottlenecks at ports of import with the inability to quickly clear cargo and unload containers. And this, of course, leads to increased demurrage. And you might recently have read, and if you are in the citrus industry, you'll also know this firsthand. At the moment, there are massive port delays in China, and a number of Australian exporters of citrus have had their fruit sitting on the docks, which of course is not a great way to treat fresh produce. Some exporters are also looking at combined shipment modes, urgent by air supply and longer term supply by sea. But of course, air freight costs are considerably higher, which eats into profit margins. But the question you need to ask yourself is weighing that profit against the potential of losing a customer if you cannot supply on time. So what are we covering off today? Today, we're going to be looking at taking action and making sure that you adapt your business model and your freight and logistics strategies to encompass a little bit more than you might have done in the past, and to make sure that you address some of the very specific challenges, but also some of the opportunities that are in the market at the moment. We're going to be looking at technology, building and growing your networks, considering the last mile, and also building better supply chains, rethinking risk, and positioning for growth. So definitely now is the time for action. And we've said this before, but this is definitely not the time for business as usual. Smart businesses have to acknowledge that COVID-19 impacts are here to stay. And of course, it's not just the COVID-19 impacts, it's some of those other issues that we've mentioned already. International travel is likely to be impacted for many years to come, and that is going to reduce belly space in aircraft and add pressure to sea freight. Costs will stay high as demand remains at a premium. And that means that you have to take those higher costs into account when you are determining the selling price of your product. Supply chains are changing. Sourcing and supply networks need to be rethought and need to be managed so that future risk can be managed along with them. And freight and logistics needs to be part of a whole of enterprise strategy. It cannot stand in a silo on its own. The global economy is going to take time to recover. Imports are likely to outpace exports, certainly for the foreseeable future, as countries rebuild their own economies by investing in local manufacturing, and this will result in additional costs for container returns and so on. So it's vital to strategize now for this COVID normal world. So first of all, let's look at technology. It really is time to take action on those technology plans. If you've been thinking about stepping up your tech game, if you've been thinking about automating processes, procedures, etc., now is really the time to take advantage of all that technology can bring to your business. That means automating physical processes and facilities. So consider your future workforce resiliency benefits when you invest in physical automation or future technology. For example, cobots, worker plus machines could be effective and safer in a future health crisis. Machines do not sleep. People need care and attention, and having machines take some of those automated processes away means that the humans who work for you can actually spend their time and their energy on all the jobs that the machines are really bad at doing. And it means you can actually pay attention to your staff. Update technology capabilities to enhance flexibility. If you incorporate workforce flexibility requirements in future technology investments and initiatives, you'll find that both your people and your technology will work better. You need to ensure that your IT systems, of course, have the bandwidth, security, and remote systems protocols to enable working from home at scale. Your staff will be working from home for some time to come, whether it be full-time or on and off. Or, as we now know in Victoria, you can be back in the office, lockdown happens again, and people are working from home again. That is probably going to be part of our foreseeable future. Rethink some of those people-heavy processes, and that means you need to standardize, centralize, and automate your non-customer facing and non-core tasks. Concentrate on the business, which is your business. Let the other stuff be automated if you can. Warehouses, of course, are cutting costs by boosting productivity and efficiency with pick and place technologies like robotic arms, automated guided vehicles, automated storage and retrieval, and various other processes. And that means that people are freed up to deal with people. Now is also the time for you to build your digital future. You need to become a data-driven enterprise. Data-driven enterprises are those that maximize the value of data and treat it as the strategic asset that it is, and they use it to anticipate and respond to future events. IoT, which connects multiple physical devices, the Internet of Things, will become crucial as the need to digitally monitor and transfer data increases. Your systems need to talk to each other, and your machines need to talk to each other. Efficient use of cloud computing and SaaS, so software as a service, will also save technology investment costs. You don't have to buy anything outright anymore. You can use cloud computing and you can use software as a service, which will help you manage your cash flow while still getting all those benefits of technology. Just going back to IoT for a moment, it's also important to know that if you have a properly connected enterprise, you will also save a great deal of money on things like energy. You won't be duplicating systems and processes, etc. So it's also a way for you to manage your cash flow. You need to create the ultimate agile enterprise, which means model organizations, processes, and technologies to achieve speed, adaptiveness, and stability. Very importantly, you need to establish a knowledge repository. And that means somewhere where you can store information that is easily accessible to everybody over your enterprise. Monitor the regulatory, the market, the customer, and the competitive environments. And if you've got all of that information at your fingertips, you can execute with certainty as your markets begin to re-emerge and come back up to speed. Technology can help you do this very effectively. Artificial intelligence, for example, will help you trawl through all those internet sites where you need to find the sort of regulations, for example, and it will do it very efficiently and actually very cost effectively. And also think about building virtual branches. So explore the possibility of converting smaller physical branches into permanent virtual branches. Now, just a word about blockchain. In 2019, worldwide spending on blockchain solutions was at $2.7 billion. It's also expected that by the end of this year, this number is expected to climb all the way to $11.7 billion. Now, there's a reason why people are investing in blockchain. It's been one of the most steadily increasing industry reshaping global logistic trends through the past few years, and the rise shows no signs of stopping. As data becomes more and more crucial to optimize those logistical operations, so do the security risks and efficiency challenges associated with processing data through the 3PL industry. Logistics technology trends will likely be characterized as we move forward increasingly by paperless data-driven systems, and that means you need secure transfer, and that means you need to be looking very seriously at blockchain if you haven't already started doing so. Networks will make all the difference to the way in which you run your business. If you make rapid adjustments to your cost structure, sound relationships with your freight forwarders and logistics providers will ensure adaptability and flexibility in both service supply and costs. But that means you need sound relationships with your freight forwarders and all your other providers. You need to build strategic alliances. You can negotiate better freight prices by consolidating shipments with aligned companies, for example. You could also become part of quid pro quo relationships where you might have space in a container that you can assist somebody else with, and vice versa. You might have read recently that one of the large mining companies needed to get equipment very quickly into South America, couldn't rely on any commercial way of doing it. So they did it themselves by literally renting an aircraft and filling its belly with the equipment they needed to fly. Now, if you had a relationship with that mining company and you needed to get something into that same market, you might be able to take a little bit of that belly space yourself. So start thinking about those strategic alliances. Adapt your network and your services. So evaluate and realign your network models. Also think about the location and your service capabilities for the new normal. And keep monitoring operations and regulatory bodies to adapt your network nodes and your services to anything that can be thrown at you. I cannot stress enough that now is not the time to neglect your people. We've just talked about the necessity for technology, but technology doesn't work in a vacuum. So the Toyota principle of automation, which is automation with a human touch, has very much been proved to be the most adaptable method. This involves automating around 80 to 90% of the system and then allowing a 10 to 20% opportunity for human expertise to improve system operation. Now, that, of course, is a stat that works for a company like Toyota. It could be very different for you. You might be looking at a 50-50 split or indeed a 30-70 split. But it is important to understand that technology works better when it's run by people. Labor should be managed as a key asset of adaptation, and remember that people need to be appropriately managed, trained, and cared for, particularly in difficult times. Last mile delivery is a very important thing for you to focus on. Now, the first mile in your supply chain, as we all know, is really important. But a whole of supply chain approach means that the last mile is just as important, if not more so. The last mile can significantly impact your delivery and your bottom line. And why do we say that? Well, the last mile is very expensive. The World Economic Forum anticipates that by 2030, 60% of our population will live in cities, and this number is set to increase to 70% by 2050. That means a lot of goods get into ports, and then they have to make it into very congested cities. Coupled with growing e-commerce needs, expanding urbanization means that a major transportation and logistics industry trend will be last mile delivery initiatives. Last mile delivery costs account for more than half of companies' overall logistic costs, and that means they need to be managed appropriately. Also bear in mind that until the goods are actually in the hands of your customer, they haven't arrived. Also, just a word on reverse logistics. Related to the rise in e-commerce is the need for good reverse logistics management in 2021. Now, even if you're not in the business of e-commerce, even if you're selling through traditional export channels, this affects you because it affects the way in which goods move and the demand for that movement. Reverse logistics includes all the value-added services that companies provide after the point of sale. So post-sale services such as returns, refurbishment, repairs, recycling, etc. So whether you're selling via e-commerce or you're selling through more traditional channels, chances are you are already having to do a good deal of this. In 2020, returns made up to 50% of some e-commerce sellers' total shipments, and they made up a considerable amount of the more traditional channel shipments as well. So good reverse logistics management will become an even bigger part of the logistics and supply chain going forward. And when later on in the series we do a bit of crystal ball gazing, we're going to look in more detail at reverse logistics. Now, if you are going to grow a better business in this current environment and make the most of the opportunities available in the new COVID normal world, you have to build better supply chains. Building resilient supply chains, according to Sean Harapko of EY, he says, supply chain resilience is more than just adding capacity or arranging for alternate suppliers in times of crisis. Instead, resilience entails the hard work of business continuity and scenario planning, detecting signals for potential disruption, creating a high-performance culture, adopting digital technologies, and moving in an agile manner to respond to the market when crises occur. And in that statement, you have pretty much a summary of everything that you need to be across in order to get your supply chains sorted out. So key components of resilient supply chains: redundancy. So theoretically, a resilient enterprise can build by creating redundancies throughout the supply chain. You have more than you need everywhere along the chain. You can hold extra inventory, you can maintain low capacity utilization, lots of different suppliers, etc. Of course, that works, but it is expensive and it's also very hard to manage because it's quite labor intensive. Flexibility, on the other hand, is when you increase your supply chain flexibility and it can withstand disruptions and better respond to fluctuations. To achieve built-in flexibility, you need to take the following actions. You need to adopt standardized processes, use concurrent instead of sequential processes, so things that work alongside each other rather than one thing that leads to another, and align that procurement strategy with your supplier relationships. Cultural change is also a really key component of resilient supply chains. After a disruption such as the one we've just seen, the factor that clearly distinguishes companies that recover quickly are those that have a sound corporate culture. So they all share several cultural traits, these resilient organizations. Communication, vitally important. Distributed power, so people all along the chain can make decisions. They're not waiting for one person in the organization to make decisions. They all care passionately about what they do, and they've all been conditioned for disruption. They understand disruption, they don't fear it, they take it in their stride. Now, a word on elastic logistics. So in the Industry 4.0 era, responsiveness to unexpected consumer demands can definitely make or break your supply chain strategy. So as a result, in 2021, supply chains need to be ready to expand or shrink depending on what happens in the environment. And this practice is called elastic logistics. It's one of the most crucial logistics and supply chain management trends in this year and into the future. Elastic logistics highlights the benefits of using 3PL companies to react quickly to high volume periods, because many 3PL companies use highly elastic temporary workforces to meet rising and falling production needs. So why do you need a resilient supply chain? Resilient supply chains enhance competitiveness. The rewards for building a resilient organization are substantial. If you're a toughened enterprise, you will be able to withstand all manner of disruptions, and along the way, you will also remain and become even more competitive. Now, along with getting your resilient supply chain sorted, you also need to be looking at diversifying supply chains. So diversifying the source of your supply provides added flexibility, and of course, it allows you to draw from multiple suppliers, the old not all your eggs in one basket scenario. It enables you to negotiate better deals when you have multiple suppliers involved. And if you do use a source closer to home, local suppliers are less likely to suffer the type of disruption that international suppliers are facing. And if they do, you can manage it more appropriately. Product failures, liability, etc., more easily enforced on home grounds. And low-cost country sourcing does come at a cost. Remember, if you have a problem, it's much easier to sort out at home or close to home. Now, we can't talk about supply chains without also talking about sustainable supply chains. And what do we mean by sustainable supply chains? Of course, supply chains that can look after themselves into the future, but also supply chains that will build a better world post-COVID. This means that you need to measure continuous improvement to mitigate risks and build resilience. The very severe impacts of COVID-19 have amplified public opinion and also consumer preference for responsible businesses. So that means it's not just that it's about doing the right thing. It's actually also smart business, because progressively the people downstream and upstream of your business are going to be looking to you to see that you are doing the right thing if they are going to be doing business with you. And that means you need to be transparent and accountable. COVID-19 related disruptions to global supply chains have focused attention on the preference of consumers and businesses to know where their products come from. Increasingly, consumers are not buying goods that they do not know the provenance of. And that means the businesses that you supply will need to know from you that you are doing the right thing, because if you don't, their customers will not buy from them. And that means data-driven risk assessment and improvement approaches will be key to building these sustainable supply chains. And of course, this will also share the benefits and the cost of sustainable production. The global downturn will push millions into poverty in the coming years. And if we all work together, we can all grow a better future. Now let's think about risk. Over the last few webinars, we've talked a fair bit about risk, but I think it's important to revisit risk, because even risk isn't business as usual. Of course, as always, we consider risk from an in-house production and operations perspective, from a logistics perspective, from a supplier perspective, etc. But now you also need to revisit those contracts of sale. What are your terms? How are you going to enforce your contract if things go wrong? And of course, force majeure. We've talked at length about force majeure, but it is very important to stress it again and again. You need to take that into account in your contracts of sale going forward. You need to revisit your contracts of carriage, and you need to rethink the relationship with your freight forwarder and or your customs broker. What do they bring to the table? What do you want of them in this new world? What are your expectations? What are theirs? And how do you work together to work better? Rethink your costings, rethink your pricing, and rethink your margins. This is the time for you to actually rethink how you price. Now is the golden opportunity to rethink your price, and taking into account the increased costs of getting the goods into the hands of your customer. this is absolutely the time to rethink how you are pricing and amortizing some of those additional costs. You also need to ensure that you are using the correct Incoterm, and that means using Incoterms 2020. It also means, however, that you need to rethink which Incoterms you use as standard. Now might be the time for you to moving to those less risky Incoterms for you, and to shift some of those Incoterms onto your customers, and the risk onto your customers if they are amenable to the idea. Now, again, there's going to have to be some give and take there. If they're taking on more of the risk of carriage, you are probably going to have to come to the party with some sort of discount in the price. And you also need to be aware of, and you need to appropriately manage, increased organized crime risks. As more and more goods are moving through sea freight because air freight is less available and fewer passenger flights are available, even more importantly, you have to be aware that there are increased organized crime risks, risks of smuggling, risks of putting nefarious goods into your containers. So take care of that, be aware of it, and don't turn a blind eye. Now, having talked at some length about all the things that you could be looking at, things that might be problematic, how to reassess risk, let's also look at how going forward you position your business for growth. Now, these are not strictly speaking freight and logistics issues, but I think it is really important that as part of that whole of enterprise approach, you also look now to be building back better. So, some things to think about: regionalized production and supply chain. We've already touched on this, but saving money and securing against potential disasters are the benefits that many companies are likely to be explore now. Of course, a revitalized market for regionalized production and sourcing also means new opportunities for entrepreneurs. So, just as in Australia, we're looking to our regional neighbors to maybe solidify some of those supply chains rather than going further afield, so our neighbors are doing the same and are looking to Australia, which creates a great deal of opportunity for us. Ongoing remote employees, definitely something to stay. So remote employees save you money, they enable you to retain top talent that wants that flexibility, etc., avoiding commuting, etc. But it also creates opportunities for you. If your employees are working from home, you can save some costs, but there are also ways in which you can look to leverage those employees to do other things. You might be able to have employees working more flexible hours, which means you can provide around the clock customer service, which you weren't able to do when your employees were working from an office. So think about those sorts of things. Contactless shopping, of course, is with us to stay. And this represents an opportunity for you to build some of those contactless solutions. So, for example, automatic doors. So if you're a manufacturer of door frames, of window frames, etc., you might want to consider expanding your product range. And of course, that goes beyond just contactless shopping. It goes towards the way that people are shopping today in general terms, and you diversifying what you do. There is a greater reliance on e-commerce, and that, of course, means opportunities for all sorts of things, including simplified shopping platforms, if you can come up with some of those, restricted access for minors, etc. So not only could you consider selling online, but think of how you can service the online sales community with your products and services. There's going to be an ongoing need to be clean. Obviously, that means there are things that need to be made to service this market, but also services that need to be provided. As we move forward, buyer trust is going to become even more important. So any of the actions that you take now and into the future will have a direct impact on your bottom line. So you need to understand what it is your customers want, how they want it, and also, very importantly, what their customers want. You need not just to understand your own wholesale customer, but you need to understand your customer's customer and their sentiments, and you need to be able to address those as you go forward. There is going to be a greater emphasis on health and wellness. So, enterprising companies, of course, can launch interactive health and fitness classes, for example, which is really good for your staff. Good for your staff means happy staff, and that means productive people. There are also ways in which you can supply the need going forward. Something else to think about, and this happened after the world wars. We've seen it happen after pretty much every major crisis that the world has known, and that is that we are almost certainly in for a baby boom. Already we're seeing more babies being born, and this is likely to continue into the future. And it's not just a result of lockdown, it's also because when people are uncertain, they want to have some security and they start thinking about having children when they didn't do so before. So many are predicting a baby boom, a continuing baby boom resulting from the coronavirus. Of course, if you sell products that service that industry, that's going to be really good for you. But it is also very important to consider the implications to your business from a staffing perspective. If a larger percentage of your staff is going to have maternity leave, paternal leave, etc., how are you going to plug those gaps? And again, that's where technology is going to be important. But it also means that work from home and people having more children probably work really well together. So those are all things that you can start thinking about as potential opportunities for you in this world as we move forward. The digital classroom, of course. Staff training is going to be largely online, which means you need to put aside some of the resources that are needed to develop those proper online training tools for your staff. It also means that there's an opportunity for you to create things that can be sold. This is a very important time for you to think about the financial health of your business. Now is the time for you to restructure loans, set up lines of credit so that you can grow into the future. Speak to your local governments, find out what they have by way of grants. Of course, the Victorian government has some really interesting grants available for manufacturers to help them invest in growth. Have a look at some of those. Now is also the time for you to get on a good footing with the ATO. If you have a tax debt, now is the best time ever to restructure that tax debt because they are being lenient towards businesses. Now's a time to have the conversation with your bank managers, etc., and think about your cash flow. Properly plan that. So if you have been lurching from crisis to crisis, now's the time to say enough. I'm not going to be doing that anymore. I'm actually going to properly manage the finances of my business. And I cannot stress enough that now is the time for you to put in place, if you don't already have one, a proper business disaster plan. You have to dedicate time and resources to developing a strong emergency response plan because emergencies are part of business. The better your disaster planning, the better your recovery. And in fact, you probably won't even need to recover because you will be one step ahead all the time. And that means that from a competitive perspective, you will have an advantage over your competitors because you will be ready to hit the ground running again long before they are, if you have a plan and they do not have a plan. So very important to please have that business disaster plan in place. Cannot stress that enough. And that, of course, covers every aspect of your business so that you are not left high and dry when the next crisis occurs.